Sodegi, and I have the honor to be your moderator for this public discussion, The End of Ego. As you can hear, English is not my first language. Maybe it comes for you as a shock, but it's really true. As a matter of fact, spending the first half of my life in Iran and the second half in Holland, I have no idea anymore what my first or my second language is. But one thing I can tell you, most probably, of course I cannot guarantee, but most probably I will make a lot of mistakes in the next 75 minutes. So please forgive me in advance for that. Having said that, that's the last thing you hear of me, because as we said, the title, the subject matter of today is End of Ego. So enough about me. Let's talk about the other egos. But because thank God we have a lot of at least 6 egos today who will join us here at the stage. So please allow me to tell you the program of today. We start with Erik Wie. He's the director of Dutch Doc. And then Fred Richking, writer, professor. And after that, I hope you have time for kind of Q&A with Fred. But if you don't have any time, so we go directly to the public discussion with 2 members of Cause Collective from the United States and 2 members of the Dutch artistic collective Open Co-op. And now I have to, probably I've forgotten something, let me see. Yes, yeah, I guess I'd said everything, yeah. Yeah, and if everything goes right, we will end about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and then we have, of course, you know, it's almost weekend, so drink, drugs, and rock and roll. We are in Amsterdam, after all. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, so I will try to remember your face, your hand, and then you can ask a question. And please, questions, because opinions, you know, masked as a question, that's my task. You are for really genuine questions. And please turn off your telephone. That's all, yeah. And as I can see, now maybe I'm wrong, but I guess a lot of leftish, high-educated people in this place, yeah? And in general, they don't clap, they don't applaud for other people. But please make an exception today. So every time I announce someone, you know, so the first one will be Erik Wie, the director of the Dutch Doc. Erik, would you please open the day? Now, he's coming. Yeah, thank you. It's your stage, Erik.
Thank you. It's a very short opening speech, but thank you all for joining us. Last year we organized the Dutch Doc Days, and we had different debates among many international documentary photographers, and we will try to do this today a little bit the same. It's a research, and it will not be completed by 6 o'clock if we make it till 6. I think it will be longer a little bit. We are allowed. And at the end of the session, we will not have an answer, but we will make a start with a discussion. And within a few months' time, about 3 months' time, probably we will meet again, because at the end of this meeting, we have a surprise. We're going to offer an artist in residence place for 3 months. And well, it's not only that you can apply, that more people can apply, but somebody can talk about what happened with his or her ego during these 3 months. Well, we have seen in the last couple of years that young generations, sometimes pinpointed as the Generation Y, started to look for answers for the mess that other generations made, including mine, and many uncertainties are threatening this young generation. But perhaps it's the older generation that see that as a threat. Generation Y tackles it like a challenge. Within this economy of uncertainties, these younger generations create a new compass for us. We have seen the bloom of the small urban farming communities all over the world. It's an answer to the bio-industry, which reached the end of its logic. Urban farming communities is not a research for a new way of feeding the masses. it's already the answer. It's happening all around us. So what does this have to do with photography, except for the fact that the founder of the Dutch Doc Award stopped working in the field of photography and started working in the field of urban farming, on the roof to be precise. We are here because there are also some big challenges for the documentary photographer, challenges that are closely connected to the current state of our economy and society. To be more precise, and this is a bit of an old story, which I said before, the printed media live in difficult times, especially now everybody gathers their information and inspiration from all over the world, mostly via the net, via millions of small niche portals. And documentary photography was, and still is, supported by the printed media. Also now in current days, but not in this functional stream of information. Nowadays, it shines as an almost extincted form in the art section of papers and magazines, where people still have the time to look slow, I guess. The Dutch documentary photographer searched for survival and found it in the hands of the foundations that were willing to give space, time, and money. The documentary photographer became more like an artist, created fantastic books. The Dutch photo books became world famous within the limits of their circulation of 750, sometimes even 1,000. And now this escape route is also narrowing down quickly. From 2013 on, which is in a few months' time, for example, if you look at the Dutch situation, the Mondriaan Foundation do not longer execute the task to invest in cultural publications. I know that the Mondriaan Foundation is doing their best towards our politicians to make an exception for photography, as publication is so important for photography. Let's hope that a new government coalition will listen to them. But should we wait for the politicians? Of course not. In the meanwhile, Dutch Doc will look for other possibilities, like today, at this lecture and talk show. The challenges just mentioned are not a purely Dutch issue. The shift of media and profession is a global shift. And we were inspired by community-based projects, cooperative artists and collectives, like the French photographer JR, like the Atlas Group of Walid Raad, Multiplicity from Milan, the Autolit Group from London, the San Francisco-based Cause Collective, and our own open co-op from Mokum Noord. And we were inspired by the words of Fred Ritchen and teased by the title of his upcoming book next year, Bending the Frame. So, what if the photographer would see themselves not as a pure photographer, but as a creative spirit, as an entrepreneur with social goals to reach? It should broaden this field of work, his power to communicate and his income. So what if young creative and scientific spirits would join hands as entrepreneurs and simply realize together what's not to be realized alone? Or is this just another recycled hippie dream? Well, let's find out.
So now it's time for our keynote speaker, Fred Ritchen. And he's the professor of photography and imaging at New York University, and also co-director of photography project Human Rights, also at New York University, and the author of After Photography, which is now translated in 7 languages. And I guess today was yesterday was the launching of the Turkish edition of his book. And I don't know why, but I am ashamed, as a matter of fact, to say that it's not translated in Dutch. But maybe we should ask him. So please, Fred, would you please?
I know I have to talk into the mic, but I won't for the first few sentences.
Okay, yeah. Why is your book is not translated in Dutch? Okay, I will ask someone later on. Okay, I will find out. Yeah.
Thank you to Eric, to Bob, to Moran, to the Dutch Doc Fund for the invitation. The question of no-ego photography I found interesting, and I thought about what would no-ego photography be, and for me the answer is very, very simple. It's photography where the subject is more important than the photographer. When I started in the field of it's live streamed. So I am not talking to you, I'm talking to the people who are not here. Hello to the people who are not here. Now I forgot what I was going to say. So how do we want to put the world back together is what I was saying. And then actually I completely forgot the next sentence. So I'll go back to the microphone and do what I'm supposed to do because it's the end of ego. Okay, one reason that I like to talk close to you is because I'd rather feel you as people instead of, pretending I'm on a screen and you're on a screen and we're not part of the same world. So that's in fact why, why I was standing there saying what I was saying. So, now I remember. What I really, really don't like in photography is how reactive it is, how photographers, for example, because of the medium, wait for the apocalypse. And when the apocalypse happens, they make amazing pictures of it. The war happens, we rush to the war, we make great pictures, we win all these prizes and awards, we're honored and respected. I really, really like the photographers who try to prevent the war. That's partly what I mean by a peace photographer. I'd much rather see people prevent climate change than wait for the horror of climate change to make spectacular images using media. Is that clear? That makes sense? I mean, you're here, so I'm talking to you. Okay. So the book is called, for next June, which I just finished writing a few weeks ago, Bending the Frame, and obviously bending the frame is the idea of rethinking photography. It's a moment to rethink it. The French Revolution, I was just in Turkey, the Turkish Revolution, the American Revolution, any revolution is revolutionary. So far we haven't had much of a revolution in photography except we have all kinds of new fancy equipment. It's faster, it's more efficient, but we haven't really rethought what we're doing. So that's what I want to talk about. So what I'm trying to talk about is towards the photography of peace and healing. And as I was doing research for Bending the Frame, I realized that lots and lots of people are doing, in fact, that. And I wanted to start with a quote from Robert Adams, the American photographer who's worked in the American West in particular. And he started in an article, "One summer afternoon, I stopped photographing and gave myself to thinking about a dream. What if there were a specific site here where those concerned with threats to the future could come and in the silence of the prairies, strengthened by the knowledge that others had come here in concern before, focus their thoughts on changes needed to safeguard life?" So he's asking, as he photographed in the American West, and he's horrified by the destruction of the forests and the environment and the building of all these houses and roads and factories and cars and so on and so forth. He just said, I'll stop photographing, and it's more important to think, what can we all do to safeguard the future? How can we do it differently? And what if we all had one space, one place where we went to and we all asked the same question, knowing that other people had been there before asking the same question? And it has to do with the slowing down of photography, with the idea of thinking with photography, and with the idea also that as one moves into the future, in some ways the worst guide is the past. If you just do it the way people did it before, it's interesting and it's certainly important, but you have to take account of the future. And I always use the quote from Marshall McLuhan that we're all going 150 kilometers an hour looking through the rear view mirror. And in fact, that's what we do. We're so proud of our speed and speed and speed, but we don't do anything very much differently for most of the time. So I want to just talk first about a project I worked on in the mid-1980s. I had been picture editor of the New York Times Magazine, and when you're doing that, we published 1,600,000 copies every Sunday, and it was a very, very influential magazine, and you'd assign photographers around the world, and you would always be looking at things and witnessing things and showing things. But then I started teaching at the International Center of Photography, and Bruce Davidson, the American photographer, called me. He did the book East 100th Street in East Harlem. And he said he'd been told by the center there, the community center, that a lot of the landlords were letting their buildings fall apart the boilers didn't work, the staircases didn't work, the ceilings fell down, so that the people living there would have to leave. Then they would fix it, raise the rents, and much richer people would come there, and the people who lived there would have no home anymore. And Bruce Davidson asked if myself and my students would in fact help the community center to make pictures of the destruction in the houses they could use in the court cases, and so on. So we had 9 students, and for more than a year we worked on the East Harlem. And the interesting thing was that the ICP, the International Center of Photography, was on 94th Street in Manhattan, and East Harlem was on 96th Street. It was 2 blocks away, but nobody ever went there because it was poor, and it was scary, and people thought it was dangerous. So what we did was this was East Harlem then, we had students, it was mostly a Spanish-speaking neighborhood, so we had one student who spoke Spanish with the other student who didn't, and they would work in the buildings. And we created this slideshow with music at the time. And what we would do was we would go to the different churches and community centers and show the slideshow, and they would tell us what they liked about it and they didn't like about it. Sometimes they didn't like the music, they didn't think it was lively enough, and it was kind of a self-criticism all the time by showing it to the people in the neighborhood and asking their opinion as to whether the images were any good or not good. And for the students, it was a way to say that their images were doing something for people. It wasn't just looking at people like I did at the New York Times. It wasn't just witnessing, but it was making images so that lawyers could use. And in fact, you know, all these very well-dressed lawyers with suits and ties came to our classroom to look at the pictures because they were representing the people, but they, you know, they didn't necessarily go to the neighborhood themselves. And newspapers and magazines were interested, and so on and so forth in the images. And you know, as we worked on it, what was also interesting, for example, was an image like this image. We were very, very criticized for this image by people in East Harlem. I thought it was a very dignified image and something that showed them in a good way. But I was told that because the beer bottle was in the picture, we were falling into the stereotype that all Latino people were alcoholics, were drunks. And that was what they were saying because they were very, very sensitive to the images, to the way they were depicted in the mainstream press. So it was something I never would have seen, and particularly I'd worked at the New York Times and I was always deciding on which images to use. But by taking the images to the subjects themselves and asking the subjects, is this helpful to you or not helpful to you, it was possible for us to change the images, to do it differently. And these were some of the images that we made to use in the court case simultaneously. So for me, the difference between working in journalism, conventional journalism, showing things, you know, as a kind of outsider versus becoming part of the community was a massive difference. And in terms of end of ego or no ego, it was always that the subject was more important, that their rights, their future was more important than the images. We may make the best image, but if it's not helpful, we would not use it there. And there's, you know, I don't have the whole slideshow here, but it went on. And so then I've worked on many, many different projects in different ways of trying to be helpful. In fact, the Bending the Frame book, the first title I had for it was called The Useful Image, that the image is useful to other people, to the subjects. It's not done to win an award or to make sure you're the best photographer, but it's useful. So these were children, orphans from the Rwanda genocide of 1994. And a guy named David Juranic led some photo workshops for them, at the beginning with disposable cameras. So on the website, you could roll over with the mouse with the cursor each kid, and then their face appears, and you get to know them. This is Jacqueline. She didn't have a second name because they didn't know who her parents were. And this picture is by Jacqueline with a disposable camera, I believe, from her first roll of film. And the idea here was to give the cameras to the kids and let them show what it was like to live in Rwanda. they sent this picture to the United States, to Camera Arts magazine, had a contest in portraiture, and she won first prize. And when the magazine in the United States asked the orphanage in Rwanda her second name, her last name, they replied she doesn't have one because we don't know who her parents were. But they also said she doesn't deserve the prize because she's only 8 years old and this is for adult portraiture. And Camera Arts magazine wrote back and said she still gets the prize because it's the best portrait we have. So she gets the prize. And the other children also made images as well with the disposable cameras from an orphanage in Rwanda after the genocide there. And when the United Nations was commemorating 10 years since the genocide of, the Hutu-Tutsi conflict in Rwanda in 2004, in the main lobby of the United Nations in New York, they used the children's images to commemorate it, because so often the outside photographer comes in and makes the children look depressed and victimized. But the children don't feel depressed and victimized, they're children. If you're 8 years old, you don't want to be shown as depressed and victimized. You have your life in front of you. So by having these pictures there, it was quite amazing at the United Nations, the Undersecretary General, everybody was holding hands around these pictures, and actually many people were weeping, and it was just a very different way to think of it. The future was for the children, not according to the outsider. And this was another project we did for the Millennium Development Goals at the United Nations, and an Argentinian photographer and writer traveled around to 8 different regions, Uganda, India, Morocco, and so on, photographing and writing, but also giving the kids cameras. And they asked them 2 questions: photograph what you like and photograph what you don't like. And this image was for the Millennium Development Goals. All the prime ministers and presidents around the world came to the United Nations on the 5th year of the Millennium Development Goals. And this was the lead image, again done by a child. And the caption is, "I like my brothers," Uganda refugee camp. And I asked the United Nations, I said, why do they look so happy in a refugee camp? I've never seen refugee camps look happy. And they told me, the secret is that this refugee camp has schools, medical care, basketball courts. It's nicer than where they came from in certain ways too. So why shouldn't they be happy? They're kids. Why do we always have to look at them as victims? So these were some of the other images. I like my mother. She makes a good lunch. I like my neighbor. This is from Morocco. And this one, the caption for this one is, "I think my brother is sometimes too protective of his siblings." And then with it, we ran by a Turkish artist, Beliz Demircioglu. She did a video screen, and on the left, if you came to the video screen, it was all static and black and white. You heard children's voices, but you couldn't see anything. And what you had to do was put your own hand against the wall and touch another hand. And if you held the hand on the wall, eventually the video would become clear, and you'd see the kids were playing in a schoolyard. They were happy, they were smiling. But if you took your hand away, the kids would be dark again and staticky, and you didn't see them. And the important thing for us was that people coming to the exhibition at the United Nations didn't just pass through, but they realized they had to touch it. They had to be part of it. And if they didn't, it was just a spectacle. But you have to engage. You have to be part of it. And this, from the Cause Collective, well, I guess some of the same members, and Bayate is one of the people who worked on it, I think is an extraordinary example of engagement. This is the question bridge, which I'm sure you'll be talking about more later. I just wanted to mention it. But it's a project where you ask African-American males what their questions are for other African-American males. And they pose the questions, the other guys answer it, and they come up their questions, and it becomes a kind of a conversation among people. And what I find so fascinating, and just briefly, is that usually a subject, you interview the subject, the outsider, but what they did, which I think is brilliant, is they asked the subjects to interview each other. And on the 5 screens, they would pose a question, like, why isn't there a blueprint? Why didn't older people tell us what to do? And then older people would answer, and there'd be a back and forth. And so there's a kind of a power distribution in which the subject becomes the interviewer and the interviewee. It becomes a discussion. And I think it would be an amazing, useful project. And in terms of no ego, it's the guys who did it are nowhere in it in terms of asking the questions. It's the subjects who ask the questions. This is a project at Amherst College done with Wendy Ewald and a guest artist. And what they did was they asked a professor, a student, and a staff member to identify themselves. And they made these massive mural-sized images all through the campus. And what was interesting there is usually in a university, in a college setting, there's like this ghetto. The students are here, the professors are there, the staff is there. But they put them all together, and they had them represent themselves and ask questions. And it became a way horizontally of breaking down social barriers. So it's not just the celebrity professor, that gets focused, but it's everybody else. This is one from Colombia, South America, from Semana.com, which I think is a very, very interesting website. This was the Minister of Agriculture. And what they do is you could click on his tie, on his shoe, on his wallet, on his watch. And each time you do that, for example, this is clicking on his tie, and it talks about his style. So all his body parts, his Achilles heel tells about his weaknesses, his wallet tells about his financial policy. So you engage the person you engage the reader, the viewer, in asking questions of the guy, so it's not a boring Minister of Agriculture giving a speech. And again, what's interesting to me about this is I never even thought, who's the photographer? It never occurred to me, because it wasn't about that. It was about the photographer acting as somebody who sets up a conversation, not as somebody who defines something as image, but who shares the power with the viewer, with the reader as well. This is one from Geneva, where people who have physical disabilities, they make a map of Geneva and they tell each other, this is difficult because of the stairs, this is difficult because you can't get in the bus. And they use cell phones to photograph the different parts of Geneva, and they make a map that way, so that taxi drivers have used it in certain places, prostitutes have used it in certain places, just to tell the community of which they belong, don't go there because you'll never get up the stairs, or the stuff that they know that other people don't know. So it becomes a kind of a community sharing of information as opposed to kind of a top-down hierarchical sense. This was another one that we worked on. This was Daylight Foundation did a year after the United States invaded Iraq. They passed around 10 disposable cameras, I think something like a cost of $200 or 150 euros, to a taxi driver, to different people to photograph their own communities. And we published this on Pixel Press, an online publication that we were running, and we also did a small exhibition at New York University where I teach, and CNN was so surprised by this. They had millions and millions and millions of dollar budgets, but their photographers and videographers didn't necessarily speak Arabic. It was too dangerous. They couldn't get in. And so they did about 5, 6, 7 minutes worldwide of these little snapshots. That was a $200 project, because we actually asked the people themselves to define themselves, as opposed to from the outside deciding who they were. If I have time at the end, this is a project I did with Gil Perez, the photographer for the New York Times in 1996. And it's very much what I'm talking about. The Bosnia for 4 years was having this horrible conflict with the Croats, Serbs, and Muslims, and they had just signed the peace accords. And so I went to the New York Times and I said, the web is very new. This is 96. It had just been around for a short time. And why don't we cover this conflict in terms of peace? We all have photographs of war, but let's make an interactive project about peace. And I'll try at the very end to show you more of that, how it worked. Okay, so now in terms of the topic, which I just introduced, of conflict, war, peace, and so on, I just want to show you a few different projects by individuals that I find really interesting. This is called Riley and His Story, Me and My Outrage, You and Us. So this is a book by Monica Haller and a young man named Riley Sarbono, who served in Abu Ghraib prison as a medic. His great desire was to come back a year later as normal from serving in Iraq, and he did not. He, in fact, forgot much of whatever happened. So she knew him from college, and when he came back, all his pictures that survived, his digital pictures, she worked with him to create this document to try to help him remember what happened. It seems that in Abu Ghraib prison, when you walked on the ground, there's like bones, and you would fall and your feet would go into the bones, and it was from all the torture victims under Saddam Hussein and so on and so forth before the scandal of the American torturing. So she says, this is not a book. This is an invitation, a container for unstable images, a model for further action. Here's the formula: Riley and his story, me and my outrage, you and me. And what she's arguing in this book, which is not a book, that it's supposed to provoke us. It's supposed to provoke us and be a reason that we go beyond the book and that we affect each other. We respond to it. We form communities. And the way it goes is, there's images and text from Riley. You could download most of the book as a PDF online for free. But it says, many events during my time in Iraq were too complex, too horrific, or beyond my understanding. There were simply too many things I witnessed there on a given day to process, so I stored them as photos to figure out later. Pictures create a concrete reality. At least I know these things happen. They continue to serve that purpose. And then he goes on, one of his images, and he goes on, there are the photos I don't remember taking. Even today, there's so much, huge chunks that I cannot figure out if the events really happened or not. So his own camera is telling him that these things happened, even though he forgot they happened and forgot he saw it, forgot he witnessed it because it was too traumatic. Photos provide the chain of events that lead your mind into a state where it's okay to kill somebody. If you don't remember the sequence of events that took you there, you can believe you are a monster. So his photographs, it's almost like a court case for himself. He remembers something horrible, but then he needs the photographs to explain why he did it or why he was part of it. He doesn't remember it. So the photographs themselves help him to a certain extent with his guilt over what happened in the war. And so the entire process of Monica Haller working with Riley is both witnessing and therapy. That the subject, Riley, who's also the photographer, that this process itself is a way to go through what happened, not just look at what happened. This is another one, Jennifer Karate in the United States, and she works a month with each soldier who's come back from Iraq or Afghanistan. And one of the horrible things I find in post-traumatic stress is that the post-traumatic stress happened over there, and they come back and nobody understands them. So what she asked them to do is to recreate the situation that happened in Iraq or Afghanistan in the United States with their family members watching, with their neighbors watching, so that they are part of it. They understand what it went through. And this guy, for example, he's haunted by the idea of the IEDs, the explosive devices on the side of the road, and he would stop to look at something just in America that means nothing to the rest of us. To him is danger. And by him stopping and becoming a picture, a staged photograph, the family members share in the trauma, and he manages to communicate some of the trauma. And he's paid attention to. He's not being asked just to repress it and forget it and do his service. So this was a woman, for example, who I think it was in Iraq, there was a woman lying on the ground who was dying, and the whole village, a number of people came to her and said, you have to save her. And she had just arrived, and so she's recreating the woman on the ground and what it felt like to just arrive and be told, you have to save the life. It's up to you. None of us can do it. You have to do it, and the trauma that invoked in her, again with her child, her mother, watching or being part of it. And this guy just, he couldn't go near windows because he got shot at. And so, it's recreating it and seeing it. So to me, this is interesting because it's not just the typical war photographer. Susan Sontag's point about war, just to stay with Sontag, was that all these images of violence never stops war. They become spectacle. We kind of, as long as we could stay distant from it, it's like a football match. We enjoy it to a certain extent. The only, which I completely disagree with her, the only image she wrote in the early 2000s that she thought was anti-war was the one by Jeff Wall of the Afghan soldiers, the giant mural, which is actually staged actors, retouched, that I think just sold for something like $3.5 million. That's the only one that made her feel anti-war. But all the war pictures are kind of seductive. So this is a kind of resistance to this. This, you probably know, is a Dutch photographer, Claire Frelich, I think it is. And what she did was to photograph soldiers as they deployed when they were in Holland, 6 months later, when they come back, just to see the change in the faces of the people and what they went through, so that there's a kind of an understanding of it. This is Suzanne Opton in the United States. She just asked soldiers to put their head down on a table because they become vulnerable. They're not warriors anymore. And these became giant billboards in the United States of the soldiers. And this is Tim Hetherington, the photographer who was killed in Misrata, Libya last year. Soldiers sleeping in Afghanistan, where he photographed the day's battle, and then he made a a multi-screen projection where you see the soldiers sleeping in the middle and on the sides of the helicopters and the bombing and all the stuff that they went through in Afghanistan that he's guessing they might be dreaming about. This is, your photographer Dijkstra here, and this is an Israeli soldier. And when I saw this recently in the Guggenheim Museum in New York just a couple of weeks ago, I thought of this guy as the enemy, the kind of scary guy, the way she photographed it up. But she also photographed him in civilian clothes, and just for this projection, I put them together. And he's not scary anymore to me. He's just a guy. And it's really wonderful to make everybody else scary so that there's a reason to hate them or to shoot them or to kill them or to be afraid of them. This is another thing to do. This is a young woman, Israeli soldier. The picture on the left by itself, the way it's presented, she seemed very military to me. But putting the civilian one next to the other one, she just seems like a girl. This is something we did on Pixel Press with Brian Palmer. For 6 weeks, he photographed one group of Marines in Iraq. Every Friday, we would put the pictures online. And the interesting thing was that the families of the Marines became our biggest readers. Like if we were late by a day, they would bombard us with emails. The saddest thing was we got an email from a mother whose daughter's boyfriend had been killed that week in Iraq, and we had the only last picture of him, and she wanted a print of it. But we became their community, and they kept saying, God bless you, you're telling us how our children are doing. They take a shower, they do this, they're alive, they're smiling. The U.S. Marines, the military will never tell us that, but you tell us that. So we formed a community, and it was interesting because I watched in the blog, in the beginning they thought we were left-wing, they called us collaborators, and they tested us out, marinemoms.com and so on, and they finally figured even though we might not agree with them politically, we could still be part of the same community because we cared about their kids. And this is a chess match between an American soldier and the Iraqi translator. The Iraqi translator won. And it was interesting to me, too, because you never see the Iraqi translators win. They're always serving the Americans. But it's another form. It's another way of seeing it. And what I think was the most important imagery in the U.S. at the time, besides Abu Ghraib images, this is by Nina Berman. And she decided to photograph the soldiers who came back who were severely wounded, because otherwise the war is far away. In the United States, it's a voluntary military, meaning that if you're poor, you join the military, and if you're wealthy, you don't. And so this guy came back. His girlfriend from high school waited for him. He had lost an arm. You can see what happened to him. It was the cover of magazines. And this was the first time, for many people, I think, that they felt what war does. When it happens to the enemy, so-called enemy, it's different. But when it happens to your neighbor, it's not so good. And she did a series called Purple Heart of just following the people and the long recoveries. And it made it very, very obvious this kind of difficulty of what happens to people. And then she would take these pictures to high schools like to poor high schools, particularly in California and Oakland, and the high school students were ready to enlist and join the Army or the Marines, but she'd go with a soldier who was very badly wounded, and what she told me was that the high school students were most upset at the bad medical care that the veterans got, because they assumed that if they joined, they'd be taken care of. And so it was a way of saying to people, don't believe necessarily the myth, because they wouldn't ask the same thing of the kids in the wealthier high schools. And this is Lori Grinker's after-war project, in which she spent many, many years just following, you know, wars don't stop. They never stop. If you've been in a war, it never stops. And this idea of the permanence of it. This is something we did in Pixel Press with Bruno Stevens at the beginning of the Second Intifada. It was a project that another major magazine had assigned but refused to publish because it was too upsetting. And what he did was just portraits in the morgue. He photographed dead people, Israelis, Palestinians, as people, you know, not just as corpses, as people. And what we did was we just did several screens of them and published it, and then you could take the mouse, the cursor, and roll over any of the guys there and find out, was he Israeli or was he Palestinian, because often you couldn't tell then. And it just seemed to us like a good thing to do, because when you're dead, you're dead. You know, it's not romantic. And instead of just all the bravado, it seemed like an important thing to do. This is what the New York Times did. All those little pixels on the screen, you could put the mouse on it, and they're all faces of men and women who died in Afghanistan and Iraq. You could still find it online. So you can go to, you know, just click on or roll over any of the little pixels and another face comes up. And this is the one that gives me nightmares, because it's almost like interminable. It's like an infinite number of faces of the dead, you know, that are all enclosed together in a rectangle. And you could also search based on their hometown. If they're from Brooklyn, you can do it by the state, you could do it, you know, they come from, and so on. But it becomes like a continuous memorial for the people who died. Obviously, it would be very good to do it for the Iraqis who died, for the Afghans who died, and so on. But it becomes a kind of way of counting war's cost. And this is in Nepal. And after what they called the People War, they exhibited photographs after it was over of what happened. And people would just line up forever to see these photographs of their own war. They'd recognize people in the photographs. They'd take their children to show them what happened. The older people would tell the younger people. In Guatemala now, the Project Granito, what they're doing is they're having kids interview their grandparents to find out what happened during the dictatorship, so that the kids are forced to talk to their grandparents, who will not speak about it normally, what happened during the dictatorship. So there's a history that's built, and there's an understanding of where they come from. And the same here in Nepal and several countries like this. And then there are photographers, speaking of no ego, who've decided not to go for the, you know, this is Gil Perez, who's very well known as a highly interesting style as a photographer, but he just works with forensic scientists trying to, and this is former Yugoslavia, trying to identify the dead. Because by identifying the dead, then the people who've been grieving, who don't know what happened to the dead, they'll be identified, and there's some resolution to the mourning. So he just sees himself in this case as of service. He's of service to the scientists. He's helping them. So that the mourning in the community can have some focus and some resolution at that point. And this is the previous speaker here, which I think is an extraordinary provocation, Broomberg and Schnaren from England. And what they did was the process of being embedded with the British troops, like the American troops and so on, is you have to sign an agreement that you can't show certain things, and you're also dependent upon them for the troops for your protection, so that you don't, if you're dependent upon people for your protection, they're the soldiers, you tend to show them in a better light because you depend on them. So what they did was they took a roll of photographic paper all through Afghanistan. They had it transported by helicopters and trucks and jeeps and so on and so forth, as embedded photographers, and they didn't tell the British Army what they were doing. But finally what they did was they just opened up the photographic paper to the sun for 20 seconds and that was their project, because they didn't want to be part of the system of embedded photographers who helped the war movement. They wanted to make a comment that was different. So at pixelpress.org, which at the time, we were on 26th Street in Manhattan when September 11th, 2001 happened, and we were very much affected. And we've found this photograph on the left of the single figure in the World Trade Tower, and then Salgado, I found his photograph in Kabul in Afghanistan of the single figure in the disaster in Kabul. And to me, they were very similar images. And so the idea here was to put them together online to say that they're just like us. We've been destroyed, they've been destroyed. Why bomb them? Because the US government was thinking of bombing them at the time. And we were trying to make the statement, they've already been bombed. Why bomb them again? And in fact, what happened was many major media organizations in the US linked to us, but none of them could do this because this wasn't fair, neutral, objective journalism. This was political and had a point of view. And we had enormous readership at that time. And then a year later, we did the same thing in the Pentagon on the right. I thought the image in Santiago, Chile, from their September 11th, 1973, when the Salvador Allende government was deposed, was a very similar image. And again, the point was, in our own grief and our own mourning, why don't we also understand the rest of the world is grieving and mourning? In Chile, September 11th means the end of their government. So let's reach out to people instead of stay within ourselves. So it's a way to use imagery to connect. Pixel Press. And then Antoinette and Robert are here. And I hadn't met them. They just sent a CD with this work on Eastern Europe, 20 years since Chernobyl, of all the above-ground testing of atomic bombs and all the accidents, not just Chernobyl, but many, many dozens of them. And the health risks. So we put this online there. And what we did here was, one of the things in the digital is very different in many, many, many ways from paper. And I don't like to put captions next to a picture because people read the caption, they don't look at the picture. The caption explains it, they don't have to look. So here you take the mouse, the cursor from the computer, and run it over the image, and then it would appear. And these are twins, 16 years old, the one in the front has hydrocephalus, and the one in the back is deaf. And this was interesting. I was teaching at another university in Philadelphia then, and one of my students in the back of the room kept falling asleep, and he was very smart, but he was asleep much of the time. But he gave this image to Boing Boing, which was one of the big blogs at the time, and I think we got 17,000 readers because of this falling asleep student putting it on the blog. And in fact, in that week, we had 500,000 readers look at 1.5 million screens of the health impact of radiation. And what was really interesting was to see that the young people, like I work in a nuclear reactor, it's completely safe. Somebody else says, well, did you see those pictures? There's a woman who wrote in from Moscow whose father worked in a nuclear scientist who died young of an enlarged heart, of all kinds of different medical issues. The people in Belarus were going online a lot. People in China were going online. The US military was going on a lot. And their series of images here was the one that really struck me. It was delivering milk in the countryside, and if there was a fly in the milk, they would very scrupulously take it out so the milk had no insects. But if the milk was too radioactive, they would just add some good milk to it so the radioactivity would go down a little bit so you could drink it at that point. And this we leave online, and I understand from Robert and Antoinette that you still get emails from it. And I think it was the governor of Kazakh in the former Soviet Union, for example, who saw their images and text and decided not to build a nuclear reactor because of these images. So the idea, again, I said in the beginning, is be proactive. How can you prevent things happening instead of just waiting for the disaster to happen is much more useful. This is the Extreme Ice Survey by Jim Balog, which in terms of ego, I think is extraordinary. He's a mountaineer, geologist, professional, and a photographer, a very, very good photographer. But what he did was he planted cameras in the Arctic, in the coldest places for the glaciers, so that every hour they would make a picture. So it's the first time scientists could see how glaciers were receding. because these cameras just stay there all year round. And so he has dozens of these cameras all over the place. So rather than just be about his own pictures, the Extreme Ice Survey was about placing them with lots of volunteers, young people and so on in different places, so we could actually understand global warming. And this was a project that I was started, but it was to photograph the future, meaning you ask scientists, for example, what's going to happen in 2070 according to the best estimate. You show, Amsterdam in 2070 or whatever it would be according to the climate change scientists, and then you photograph the future so it doesn't happen. So you might be able to warn people enough that they change habits or people do things differently so it doesn't happen. So by photographing the future, it's a way to avoid certain futures. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with just a few images. I assume I'm sort of okay on time, although... What?
I hate to say, but we have really to round up, yeah.
Say it again?
We have to round up, we have to wrap up.
Okay, so I'm wrapping up.
Yeah,
okay, I got about 6 images left. So I wasn't okay on time, and I didn't speak in the microphone. So this is one of the most famous images. So one idea that I've thought is that if you roll over the bottom right with a cursor, you find out the credit, the copyright, and so on. You roll over the bottom left of the picture with the cursor, you find out what the photographer, the subject, thought of the picture. Eddie Adams hated this picture for many reasons. You roll over the top left, you see the image before and after. You roll over the top right, you see links to other websites. In other words, in the digital, you could hide all kinds of information to contextualize you can't do on print. I also thought if you manipulate an image, the square inside, the circle inside the square with the diagonal is not a lens icon. If a photograph is manipulated, photoshopped and so on, the reader has to be told so that we preserve a certain integrity of the photography, something that I think photographers should adopt. And, the Google glasses coming, the end of the front page, the Access to Life by Magnum, for example, on HIV/AIDS for the Global Fund. The Global Fund told them that they directly raised $1 billion 2 or 3 years ago to help in HIV/AIDS retrovirals. It's still possible to make an impact. It's not the name of the photographer, it's the name of the project. And the final thing I want to say is this: in 1968, this was the amazing image of the Earth photographed in space from, by astronauts. That is credited with starting the Save the Earth movement, Earth Day, and all that, because we'd never seen our own planet as fragile in space before. Just about 3 weeks ago, these images were released, 1979, 2012, the deterioration, the diminishing of the ice pack. To me, this is equally as important, and nobody pays attention to it. So one of the issues is how do we reconstitute a photography that people will pay attention to, because the stakes are really, really high. And I think I now say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you. Please stay with us. Are there any questions from the audience right now? If there aren't, then maybe I can ask you some questions. You were very interesting speech, especially the shifting change, the change of paradigm. I really liked it very much. Still, when you are making peace photography, you mentioned some names so still ego-driven. A lot of projects you showed us, you mentioned their names, or you showed the name of the photographer. How does it rhyme with the other aspect?
It's funny. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's like if you're a social worker, I guess it's the same word in everywhere. You work with people, you have a name, but you're not doing it, for ego. You're doing it to help people. Usually, if you're a doctor, it's not about your name, it's about if the patient gets better, you did a good job.
Yeah.
And what I'm doing is by showing Monica's work or Jennifer's work or whoever, it's that they're doing it really, as many of them are doing it almost as a therapy for the people in the pictures or the people who made the pictures. And I see it, social documentary photography is almost social work at that point. So I don't see them doing it to become stars. I see them doing it to be helpful. But you're right. You know, some of them, like the New York Times one, which is anonymous, just all the people who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are no names to the photographs at all. That's fine. But how do you say this? What interested me was that 90% of the stuff I showed you just now would never win a prize. But it's really important stuff.
Yeah. And the other thing is, you said that put the subject, make the subject more important than the photographer. I really like the idea. At the same time, I thought, you know, are the people from your Harlem project or the Rwanda project, do you still know how they are doing?
Yeah, the students there are 9 of them who worked on it, and many of them stayed in touch. And the small story on that is that one of them then, for National Geographic, was asked to do a similar project in color, Joseph Rodriguez, after he graduated. And he did it, and he got the cover story of National Geographic on East Harlem. And he also got the editor-in-chief fired of National Geographic because the board felt that he was becoming too socially conscious by doing it. So I didn't mention any of the names of the students when I showed it, and they didn't want their names mentioned. There was no credits, really. It was just done. And their pride in it was being helpful. And I'll tell you, when you go and you show the subjects the pictures you make of them, it could be really scary because they could hate you. They could think that you're racist. They could think all kinds of things of you. So when you go in with the pictures of them and then ask them to respond and you're standing there, and I did that several times, it's something I never had to do in the New York Times as picture editor. I never had to ask people, what do you think of the pictures I'm making of you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So please.